Okay, since this semester I've added, or this term I've added this primary source worksheet onto the library scavenger hunt. I wanted to do just a brief video to explain this assignment. This is really a kind of preparatory thing for getting into the larger analysis papers that come in starting in the second week, and that there are three of over the course of the term. And so in this assignment, I'm simply asking you to choose anything that you have read recently as a historical source. This can be something from a really long time ago. It can be something from as recent as like yesterday or even earlier today, I suppose. It can be, and I list a few things here, a novel, a short story, a news article, an email, the lyrics of a song, a social media post, or almost anything else. If you want to, look up an email that your friend wrote you a couple of months ago and use that as a historical source, that's totally fine. If you want to, get into the lyrics of a song that your favorite artist just recorded or whatever, like you can do that. Or you could do something, like a novel, a journal, what really, the sky's the limit. It doesn't really matter. I will say that you probably want to do something that has some content in it. If this is like a text message that was like, thank you, or whatever, then maybe you could do some explanation of it, but it might not be enough material. So try to choose something a little more meaty than that. Once you have selected and read or reread your source, then you do the following. First of all, provide a summary of the source's contents. I suppose you could do a text message chain. Say you or somebody had a long conversation via text message, and you got kind of a back and forth that went on for several days, right? Rather than a single text. Within that, you could, use the conversation as this, right? So you would summarize the contents. If that's a novel, if it's a story, if it's a news article, summarize that. This should not be the largest part of the assignment. Okay, just do a little bit, 1 to 2 paragraphs. You don't have to go into a tremendous amount of detail. This is just to let the reader know, like, this is what the source says. More importantly is answering these questions. And it might be necessary, depending on what source you choose. If this is something personal to you, you probably wouldn't have to do this, but if you choose something that was written by somebody else, you might need to do a little research on this. I would start with reference works like an encyclopedia, even Wikipedia. If that has information, can be helpful to give you background stuff, to give context. You can look it up in textbooks or secondary sources. You can use, the stuff you found in the library with the other part of the assignment to help you with this, if you'd like. And then you answer these questions. 1, who was the author of this document? Don't just name them, but try to say the author, and the author lived at this time, and this is what the author was doing when he or she wrote this source. What relationship did the author have to the events or the circumstances recounted in the document? Were they a participant? Did they get this information secondhand? Was this just rumor that they were recording? How were they related to those things? What was the author's motive for writing this stuff? That's something that you can kind of dig into and think about. Like, why would they do this? Who was the author's intended audience? Obviously, you're going to write something different if it's meant for public consumption than if you're just writing, kind of privately to a single person you trust. And so that audience is going to inflect the writing. It's going to bias the information in some way. And so you need to ask and try to answer, like, how does that happen? How did the audience influence the writing? How does it bias the information in the text? What does the author include or leave out due to the intended audience? What are they not saying is often an important question to ask. And it's related very closely to the question of audience. What were the historical circumstances? That is the context. There's that word again. That we've talked about a lot already. Okay, what was the context at the time of writing? In what ways did this context influence the author and the text? This can be very specific. You could say the author was, their wife, the author's wife had just died, and he was in mourning, and therefore this was the kind of his way of working through that existential crisis in his life. That can be very specific context, or you could say something about the general context, like the people at this time had a strong belief in this aspect of this religion or whatever, and these were the prevailing values of the time period. Everyone was interested in this, or most people were interested in questions that had to do with this, right? So it can be very general, it can be very specific. Maybe try to mix those in if you can. Try to talk about the specific stuff and maybe the more general stuff, but focus on the parts of the context that bear most prominently on the information in the text, right? Don't put in things that are irrelevant. I suppose, things that might appear on the surface to be irrelevant can actually be quite relevant, but you have to explain that relationship. And then the fourth one, and you may not be able to answer this, and it might not even be relevant, honestly, depending on what source you're using. But the older a source is, the more this question is important. What do you know about the transmission and survival of this source after its writing? This can even be true for things that, were not from that long ago. If this is the kind of document or the kind of source that would normally get thrown away, like why would this be saved? How did that happen? And most importantly, when we're talking about transmission and survival, how did that transmission and survival then influence the way this text was understood? How does this help us read this with hindsight? How have the meanings of this shifted over time? If you're talking about something like, say, the Bible, or a religious text, then the transmission, the way that these things have kind of shifted in their meaning over time, is a really important question. But if it's something more immediate and more recent, then maybe it wouldn't be as important, right? So if you can't answer that question, no big deal, I suppose, but try to think about the question of transmission and survival at the very least. Okay. So hopefully that clarifies what you need to do with this assignment. And if you have questions about it, reach out, post on the course logistics board. Try to, I'm happy to give further clarification to these requirements.